The fog of Victorian London once swallowed everything. The river, the lights, even hope itself. But in those cold streets, among the penny sit-ups and coffin beds, a few forgotten souls began to dream of something different. Not revolution, not glory, just mercy. They built shelters where warmth was not a privilege, clinics where medicine had no price, and classrooms where even the poorest child could learn to write their name. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you'll walk their streets again. The alleys where Captain Wilson, Dr. Manning, and the nameless workers quietly rewrote the meaning of kindness. Because history isn't only written by kings or wars. Sometimes it's written by tired hands that refuse to stop giving. So close your eyes. Let the hum of the old city surround you. And remember, the world you rest in tonight was once built by people who believed that even the smallest act of compassion could outlast the darkest night. The fog came early that winter, thick, yellow, and heavy with coal smoke. It rolled down London's narrow streets like a living thing, swallowing lamps, swallowing sound, swallowing hope. By the time Edwin Hale reached the river, he could no longer see his own hands. Only the glow of distant fires marked where the city still breathed. He had been walking since dawn, searching for work at every printing shop from Clerkenwell to the docks. Each door had closed the same way. Sorry, no openings. The machines do it faster now. Now, as night settled like a shroud, Edwin's stomach ached with hunger and the soles of his boots had split open. Every step drew water from the cobblestones. The fog turned it to ice. He thought of warmth not as comfort anymore, but as memory. Along the embankment, he passed figures curled beneath newspapers, outlines of men who looked carved from ash. A woman whispered through chattering teeth, "A penny for a sit-up, sir?" He had nothing to give. Ahead, a faint bell rang, 3 slow tolls, calling the destitute toward the Salvation Army line. He followed the sound, drawn by the promise of light. Inside the hall, steam from the soup pots blurred the air. Dozens stood shoulder to shoulder, bowls trembling in their hands. Edwin joined them, accepted half a ladle of broth, and sat on a bench still damp from the last man's coat. The broth tasted of salt and smoke but slid down like forgiveness. For a few minutes, the ache in his stomach eased. Across from him, an old sailor spoke softly. "They call it the penny sit-up," he said, gesturing to the next room. "Pay a penny, you sit all night on a bench. Rope across your chest to keep you from falling. No lying down. That costs 4. He smiled without humor. "Even rest is a business now." Edwin managed a faint laugh, then felt it catch in his throat. Could a man truly buy peace even for an hour? Outside again, the fog thickened until it seemed to hum. Gaslight halos flickered and died. Somewhere nearby, horses screamed, startled by shadows they couldn't see. Edwin pressed his coat tight and kept walking, though he had no destination. He passed shuttered shops, a beggar's violin, the soft thud of distant church bells marking 9. Every sound felt distant, like he was already halfway invisible. He paused beneath a broken street lamp and looked up. The mist had erased the stars. When had he last seen the sky clearly? When had London itself last drawn a clean breath? And you, listening now, can you imagine a city where sleep must be purchased by the inch? Where warmth has a price and mercy comes with a receipt? How much would you pay for a night without hunger? A coughing fit doubled him over. Each spasm echoed in the empty street until it sounded like a chorus. He wasn't alone. The city coughed with him. That realization, strange as it was, gave him a trace of comfort. Shared suffering, he thought, was still a kind of fellowship. At the corner of Fleet Street, a poster flapped in the wind. Riots at Trafalgar Square. Police clash with unemployed. He touched the paper with numb fingers. People were fighting somewhere beyond the fog. For bread, for work, for dignity. He whispered to no one, "Maybe tomorrow I'll join them." But even that idea felt heavy. Tonight, all he wanted was to sit, to rest his eyes, to stop shivering. He turned toward the alley where the sailor had pointed. A flickering sign read shelter, penny a night. From within came the creak of benches, the smell of wet wool and weak tea. Edwin hesitated at the door, coin in hand. The last of his money. Was it worth a penny to feel human again? He stepped inside. And you, would you have done the same? Would you trade your last coin for a seat among strangers, just to pretend the world still had a place for you? Close your eyes and breathe in the fog. Hear the quiet shuffle of tired feet, the soft click of coins on wood. This is where our story begins. in the cold heart of London, where even hope must be rented by the hour. The smell hit first: wet coats, cheap gin, and human fatigue. Inside the penny shelter, every bench was filled, every breath shared. Edwin stood in line, coin in hand, watching the keeper loop a thick rope across the room from post to post. It sagged slightly under its own weight, like a weary thing preparing for another night of bodies leaning on it. 1 penny, the keeper barked. Edwin slid his coin across the counter. The man nodded toward an empty spot near the end of the rope. Sit up straight, no lying down. Anyone sleeps, we cut the rope early. He said it like a threat, but his eyes were tired. Tired of saying it, tired of watching the same faces return each night. Edwin found a space between 2 men, both older than him, both already half asleep with their heads bowed. The bench was narrow, the rope rough against his chest. When he leaned forward, it dug into his ribs. Behind him, someone coughed, a deep rattle that didn't stop. Somewhere else, a baby whimpered. The air was too thick to breathe, too heavy to hope. The keeper walked the aisle with a lantern. Its flicker moved across faces, faces without names, without pasts, without futures. For a penny you got 4 walls and permission not to die outside. Nothing more. First night? Asked the man beside him, voice like sandpaper. Edwin nodded. You'll get used to it, the man said. Or you won't. Either way, you'll come back. Then he chuckled softly. We all do. The rope quivered as the last few men settled. A strange hush fell, broken only by the rhythmic creak of wood as bodies shifted. The sound was almost hypnotic, like waves, like breathing, like resignation itself. Edwin tried to rest his head on his folded arms, but the rope pressed him upright again. Sleep came in fragments, short, desperate snatches before pain woke him. Can you imagine it? Leaning forward through the night, every muscle trembling, the rope cutting into your chest. Not allowed to lie down, not allowed to dream too deeply. Would you pay a penny just to stay alive until morning? Somewhere in the dark, a man began to mutter a prayer. Another joined in, then another. The sound was not pious but tired, an instinct, not faith. Even God must have turned his face from this place long ago. Edwin's thoughts drifted between memories. His father's print shop, the smell of ink and paper, the warmth of a real fire, his wife's laughter before sickness took her. They felt like stories he'd read once, not things he had lived. He wondered if anyone outside this room knew the word rope night. If they did, would they care? A sudden jerk pulled the rope tighter. Someone had slumped too far forward. The keeper stormed over, shouting, Sit up, damn you, sit up. He yanked the rope high, and the man gasped awake, face pale, eyes rolling. Then silence returned, heavier than before. Hours passed, time measured not by clocks but by pain. Edwin's neck stiffened, his legs numb. Each heartbeat echoed against the rope. At one point he thought he heard rain outside. But maybe it was just the slow drip of condensation from the ceiling. Near dawn, the keeper cut the rope loose. It fell in one motion, dumping the roomful of men forward. Some grunted, others simply stayed down. That was the signal. Night was over. Rest, such as it was, had expired. They shuffled out into the freezing street. The fog had thinned but not vanished. It clung to their coats like ghosts unwilling to let go. The street lamps still burned weakly, halos in the gray. Some men turned toward the docks, others toward factories opening their gates for the morning shift. Edwin stood motionless, staring at the empty penny he'd traded for a sleepless night. The city stretched before him, cold and endless. And you, if you were standing there, would you have felt anger or only numbness? Would you curse the rope or the world that made it necessary? He didn't know the answer, and maybe that was the cruelest part. How suffering became ordinary, invisible, routine. The wind carried the smell of baking bread from somewhere far away. It made his stomach ache. He turned toward the sound, toward life, toward the faintest promise of warmth. Behind him, the shelter door slammed shut. That sound, the closing of it, was the loneliest thing in London. Morning found Edwin in the gutter behind the shelter, half frozen and barely conscious. Someone must have stepped over him while leaving. His coat was damp, his shoes gone. London mornings were like that. No one looked down unless there was money on the ground. A whistle shrieked from somewhere near the river. Factory horns followed, echoing off the brick canyons. He stood, shivering, and began to walk toward the sound. To move was to stay alive. By midday, hunger gnawed harder than the cold. At the corner of Whitechapel Road, He joined a crowd gathering outside the parish gate. A sign read, "Workhouse admissions, limited." The word limited hung like a curse. A constable stood guard, face unreadable beneath his helmet. One by one, the desperate were allowed in. Mothers with infants, the sick, the old. When Edwin's turn came, the constable looked him over, mud-caked, hollow-eyed, breathing shallow. Name? Edwin Hale. Trade? Printer. The man hesitated. Married. Was. That single syllable seemed to pass the test. The gate opened. Inside, the air was thick with lye and boiled cabbage. Men stood in rows while a clerk recorded names. Clothes were stripped away, replaced with coarse uniforms that itched like nettles. A guard marked each man's arm with chalk. M for male, A for able-bodied. Able-bodied meant work. They were marched down a corridor of stone. Each step echoed like a verdict. In the laundry, women scrubbed rags until their hands bled. In the workroom, men crushed bones for fertilizer or picked oakum from old rope. The sound of tearing fibers filled the air, a rasp that seemed to scrape at the soul itself. A man next to Edwin whispered, "They call it repentance through labor." He smiled without joy. "I call it dying slow." Edwin was set to oakum picking, sitting for hours unraveling rope with a blunt nail. The fibers cut into his fingertips, leaving red crescents. Dust clung to his throat, dry as paper ash. When the overseer passed, everyone worked faster, pretending industry equaled virtue. Have you ever wondered what a man's worth becomes when measured in rope? How many fibers must he pull apart before he earns the right to eat? Would you keep working, just for the promise of soup? At dusk, a bell rang, one long tone that sounded almost merciful. They were led to the dining hall, where each man received a tin bowl of broth and a hunk of bread. Silence was mandatory. The only sounds were spoons clinking against metal and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. Edwin chewed slowly, tasting not food but the absence of hunger. Across the table sat an elderly woman with silver hair cut short, a scar tracing her jaw. She caught his eye, her voice a whisper. "They say we pay for our sins with hunger," she said. He looked down at his bowl. What sin was poverty? The woman's smile was small and tired. The oldest one, being born poor. That night they slept on straw mats laid in tight rows. Guards patrolled with lanterns, making sure no one spoke after lights out. Even dreams were considered rebellion here. From somewhere in the darkness came a cough, then another, then another. Soon the room was a chorus of illness, human suffering echoing in unison. Edwin lay awake, staring at the rafters. The smell of disinfectant and breathless despair mingled into something almost unreal. He thought of the rope from the night before, how it had pressed into his chest. Now there was no rope, no freedom even to sit up. The workhouse had perfected control. The body exhausted, the spirit dulled. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the high windows. Each drop sounded like a clock marking time he no longer owned. He wondered if anyone outside these walls heard it the same way. If the sound of rain could still mean comfort to someone else. And you, lying somewhere warm, safe, uncounted. Could you sleep beneath this roof of rules and sorrow? Could you trade your name for a number, your breath for bread? How long before kindness itself feels like a memory? Edwin closed his eyes. The chorus of coughing rose and fell like the tide. The overseer's boots faded down the corridor. In that faint, momentary silence between one cough and the next, he imagined the sound of printing presses, paper turning, words being born. As if somewhere in London his old life still existed, waiting for him to wake. They released him at dawn with a single copper coin and a crust of bread. The workhouse door shut behind him with a sound that felt final. For a moment, Edwin just stood there, blinking at the pale London light, as if unsure which world he belonged to, the one of walls or the one of fog. The air outside was sharp and alive. Horses clattered down the street. Vendors shouted half-heartedly about apples and fish. Everything moved with purpose except for him. He walked toward the river again, coin in his palm, not knowing where to go but certain he couldn't go back. By afternoon, he found himself near Charing Cross, where crowds had gathered in restless knots. Placards waved above heads, work or bread. Men shouted from barrels, their words swallowed by the city's roar. Women clutched children tight. Someone passed Edwin a leaflet, ink still fresh, smelling of rebellion. Mass meeting at Trafalgar Square. Justice for the unemployed. He remembered the press, the paper, the feel of type beneath his fingers. Something stirred in him, a long-sleeping instinct. He followed the tide of people up the hill, into the square that had become London's open wound. Hundreds, maybe thousands, had gathered beneath Nelson's column. Fires burned in oil drums, their smoke coiling into the fog. Faces glowed red in the light, not from warmth but fury. Speakers shouted about hunger, about families dying in alleys while Parliament debated the price of coal. The air throbbed with desperation that smelled almost like hope. Edwin found a place near the steps. The bread in his pocket had gone hard, but he ate it anyway, eyes fixed on the flames. He felt the same heat inside him, something between anger and awakening. Then came the sound that changed everything. The sharp crack of boots on stone. Police lines formed at the edges of the square, black coats gleaming, truncheons raised. Someone shouted, "Hold the line." Someone else threw a bottle. It shattered near the monument, glass scattering like sparks. The first charge hit fast. Men shouting, women screaming, the fires knocked over. Edwin ducked as a truncheon swung past his head. The air filled with smoke and the bitter smell of burning cloth. He stumbled backward, coughing, his vision blurring. A child cried out somewhere behind him. He turned, searching, but saw only chaos. Faces twisted by fear, shadows of uniforms pushing forward. For a heartbeat, London itself seemed to ignite. The fog, the smoke, the anger, all blended into one vast living storm. Edwin pressed his sleeve to his mouth and ran. He didn't know where the fire began or who had started it. Maybe it didn't matter. In a city built on hunger, anything could burn. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a young woman dragging a cart of rags. Her hair was streaked with ash, her eyes fierce. "You running from it or toward it?" she shouted. He hesitated. "I don't know." She laughed bitterly. "That's London for you." Then she was gone, swallowed by the smoke. He found refuge beneath an archway off the Strand, chest heaving. Above him, the sky glowed red where the fires reached upward, licking the clouds. Soot rained down like black snow. He thought of the workhouse again, how its walls had been clean, its rules precise. But here, in this chaos, people were finally being seen. Their suffering was no longer quiet. Tell me, if you were there, would you have stayed to fight? Would you lift a stone, knowing it might mean prison or worse? Or would you, like Edwin, find yourself caught between hunger and fear, watching history burn from the edge? The sound of sirens grew distant. The fires crackled lower. By midnight, the square was empty except for the injured and the smoke. Edwin walked among the embers, his boots leaving black footprints on the stones. A charred poster lay at his feet, its words half-burned but still legible. "Bread for the living." He folded it carefully, slipped it into his coat. Not as a memory but as a promise. The world might not have room for dreams anymore, but perhaps it still had room for witnesses. And that night, beneath the dying fires of Trafalgar Square, Edwin Hale, printer, pauper, survivor, became one. The fog returned, soft and silent, blanketing the ruins as if to put the city back to sleep. Only the faint hiss of smoldering wood broke the stillness. And you, lying there listening, can you hear it still? That quiet crackle of something ending, or perhaps something beginning? When the smoke cleared, London looked half dead. The fires at Trafalgar had died to ash, but their scent clung to the city, soot on the breath of every passerby. Edwin walked through the ruins of the square, stepping over shards of glass that glittered faintly in the morning fog. The cold bit harder after the warmth of flames. From somewhere nearby came a thin, whistling sound. Not wind, music. A street boy sat on the edge of a fountain, blowing through a broken reed pipe. He couldn't have been more than 12, his coat several sizes too large, his shoes mismatched. When he saw Edwin watching, he grinned, revealing a gap where a tooth should be. "You look like the square hit you harder than it hit the cobblestones," he said. Edwin almost laughed. "You could say that." "Name's Finch," the boy announced. "Like the bird. Only less lucky." Finch hopped down from the fountain and studied him with quick, assessing eyes. "You got the look of someone who hasn't eaten since yesterday. Maybe longer." "Maybe," Edwin admitted. "Come on then," said Finch. "I know where the bread's cheap and the tea's free, if you don't mind listening to a sermon first." They walked through narrow alleys where fog pooled like old secrets. The smell of coal smoke and wet stone filled the air. Finch moved fast, darting between carts and beggars with the confidence of someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere. He led Edwin to a small mission hall tucked between warehouses, its door open, warm light spilling into the street. Inside, volunteers ladled soup into tin bowls. No one asked questions, only names. Edwin hesitated when a woman offered him a bowl. "Pay later if you can," she said softly. Finch winked at him. "See? Told you. Miracles happen if you look poor enough." They sat together on a wooden bench. The soup was thin but hot, and the bread didn't break your teeth when you bit it. For a while neither spoke. Then Finch broke the silence. "You were at the riot, weren't you?" Edwin looked up sharply. "How did you?" "I saw you. Near the steps. Looked ready to shout but didn't." He shrugged. "Not many folks know when to stay quiet." "Smart move." "Wasn't smart," Edwin said. "Just scared." Finch's grin faded. "That's the same thing most days?" After the meal, the mission workers began handing out pamphlets about temperance and salvation. Finch rolled his eyes. "Here we go, drink bad, prayer good. Every night the same tune. Why do you come then?" "For the soup." He smirked. "And the warmth. God can have the rest." Outside, the fog had thickened again, turning the world into a soft gray blur. Finch kicked at a loose stone, watching it skitter away. "Got a place to sleep?" he asked. "Not tonight." "Well," Finch said, "you're in luck. I know a spot the police don't bother with. Costs nothing but a story." "A story?" "Yeah. Everyone who stays tells one before they sleep. Keeps the ghosts quiet." He led Edwin through the maze of alleys to a narrow arch beneath a bridge. There, a small fire burned in a metal barrel, surrounded by a half-dozen street sleepers. Men, women, and children wrapped in rags like cocoons. The river's black surface gleamed nearby, reflecting the flicker of flame. One by one, the others told their tales. A sailor who lost his ship, a widow turned away from the parish, a boy who sold newspapers until winter took his fingers. When it was Edwin's turn, he spoke of the workhouse, the rope, the riot. His voice trembled, but Finch listened without pity, only attention. When he finished, Finch nodded solemnly. "You tell good stories. That's worth something." Then he tossed him an extra scrap of blanket. "Here. You earned it." The fire crackled softly. Someone hummed a lullaby that had no words. The sound mingled with the slow lap of the Thames against the stone. "Tell me, if you were there, would you have traded your bed for this place? The warmth of strangers for the cold comfort of walls? Would you tell your story just to keep the ghosts away?" Edwin lay beside the fire, the blanket rough but real. He felt the weight of exhaustion give way to something gentler. Around him, London breathed, a city of smoke and sorrow but still alive. And for the first time in many nights, he didn't dream of ropes or coffins or gates. He dreamed of wings, small and black as soot, rising over the Thames. Winter came back to London like a debt collector. Cold, relentless, impossible to bargain with. By late November, the fog no longer drifted. It settled, thick and unmoving, sealing the city beneath a lid of smoke. The Thames froze along its edges. Street fires burned day and night, but the chill still crawled beneath every coat and blanket. Edwin and Finch made their home beneath the same bridge for nearly a month. The nights grew colder, the fires smaller. One evening, when even the river seemed to shiver, Finch looked up from his hands and said, "We can't stay here another night. Not if it snows." Edwin agreed. The cough in his chest had deepened to something that hurt when he breathed. They followed the sound of church bells, hoping to find shelter, or at least food. But the missions were full. The door of the parish hall bore a sign written in hurried chalk. "No beds. Try Burn Street." Finch frowned. "Burn Street? That's the coffin place." He spat the word like it was poison. Edwin's stomach turned cold. He remembered it, the wooden boxes, the coughing, the smell of straw and death. But the frost in the air left no choice. The line outside the fourpenny coffin stretched halfway down the street. People shuffled in silence, their breath rising in pale clouds. Finch tugged at Edwin's sleeve. "You sure about this?" "No," Edwin admitted. "But I'm sure about freezing to death." When they reached the front, a tired Salvation Army clerk took their coins without looking up. "Men's dormitory, second door. Tea first." The tea was bitter, the bread stale. But the warmth of the room felt like grace. Finch sniffed the steam rising from his cup. "If I close my eyes, I can almost believe it's soup." Edwin smiled weakly. If you close your eyes long enough, anything can be home. Inside the sleeping hall, rows of wooden coffins lined the floor, each barely wide enough for a man to lie flat. Finch's mouth dropped open. They're serious. Actual boxes. Welcome to London's idea of mercy, Edwin murmured. They claimed too near the back. The boards creaked under Finch's small weight. Smells like someone already died in this one. Someone probably did. Around them, the room filled with coughing murmurs, the faint rustle of straw. An old man near the door whispered prayers to no one in particular. A woman sobbed softly into her sleeve. Edwin lay back and stared at the low ceiling. The flicker of the single lamp cast long, coffin-shaped shadows across the walls. He thought of the riot, the fire, the bridge, Finch's reed pipe. All the places he had tried to rest. None of them truly meant rest. Then Finch spoke, voice barely above a whisper. You ever think about what it'd be like not waking up? Edwin turned his head. You're too young to ask that. Too young to freeze too, Finch said simply. His words hung between them like frost. A fit of coughing echoed from somewhere near the door, deep and ragged. The sound didn't stop. It built, then broke into silence. Moments later, two workers carried a limp figure out of the hall. No one spoke. No one asked who it was. Another coffin was filled before the door even shut again. And you, would you have dared to close your eyes in a place like this? Could you sleep, knowing the man beside you might never wake? Would you still dream? Finch whispered, Why do they call it the coffin house? Edwin answered softly, Because it's practice. Finch's laugh was small and bitter. Good thing I'm not good at practice. Somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled midnight. Each chime felt slower, heavier, as if time itself had grown tired. Edwin's body ached, but warmth slowly returned to his hands. For now, at least they were alive. He reached into his coat pocket and found the charred leaflet from Trafalgar Square. Bread for the living. The paper was worn thin, but the words still held. He pressed it flat against the coffin wall just above his head. Reminds me what we're still fighting for, he whispered. Finch squinted at it. Bread? No, Edwin said. The living. They fell silent, listening to the soft breathing around them, the sound of dozens of lives clinging to the edge of night. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Inside, the room was thick with the smell of sweat, wood, and hope's ashes. Close your eyes just for a moment. Imagine the weight of that air, the heat of bodies, the hunger, the quiet defiance of survival. Imagine paying 4 pennies just to dream. Then slowly let that image fade, until all that remains is breath. Yours, theirs, ours. The morning bell clanged before the sun rose. Dozens stirred inside the coffin house, rubbing stiff joints and coughing into their sleeves. The smell of wet wood and breath lingered heavy as fog. Finch sat up, hair sticking in every direction. Didn't think I'd see daylight again, he muttered. You did, Edwin said. That's enough. They shuffled toward the exit, their footsteps hollow on the worn boards. Outside, the frost glimmered pale over the cobbles, and the air bit hard enough to feel alive again. Finch blew into his hands. So what now? Back to the bridge? Not yet, Edwin said. Let's see what the day looks like first. The day looked gray. Always gray. A line of people wound around a corner nearby, each clutching coins or scraps of paper. Finch tilted his head. Another shelter? A woman in the queue overheard. No, something new. Run by a Captain Wilson. Says no one's turned away. Even if you've got nothing. Finch laughed. No one turned away? Then it'll be full by noon. Still, curiosity was stronger than doubt. They followed the line through the fog until a modest brick building appeared. The sign above the door read simply, The Salvation Army Experimental Shelter. The word experimental gave Edwin pause. Everything in London had a cost. What was the cost here? Inside, the air was warm, faintly scented with soap and bread. No ropes. No coffins. Rows of plain straw mattresses lined the hall, clean and evenly spaced. Men and women spoke in low voices, not the frantic mutter of the desperate, but something gentler. Conversation. A young woman in a Salvation Army bonnet greeted them. Good morning, sirs. What can you pay? Finch shrugged. 2 pennies between us. That will do, she said without hesitation. If it were none, that would do as well. She smiled, an honest, human smile that seemed to break something open in Edwin's chest. They sat at a long table while volunteers served soup, thicker than any they'd had before. Actual vegetables floated in it. Miracle. Finch stared into his bowl like he was afraid to blink. It's real. Eat before it vanishes, Edwin murmured. The room hummed softly with the sound of spoons and quiet conversation. No guards shouting, no sermon blaring, no coughs echoing like judgment. For the first time in weeks, silence felt peaceful, not cruel. After the meal, the woman returned. Captain Wilson will speak soon if you wish to stay. Finch groaned. Knew there was a catch. A speech. But Edwin, curious, nodded. We'll listen. Captain Wilson was not what they expected. No polished officer, no booming preacher. He was a small man with kind eyes and a voice barely louder than the creak of the floorboards. He spoke simply as if to equals. You are here because you need shelter, he began. And you will have it. Without questions, without shame. A man's worth is not measured by the coins in his pocket, but by the breath in his lungs. The room grew still. Even Finch looked up from his soup. Wilson continued, the world believes you must suffer to deserve help. I do not. You are human. That is reason enough. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, someone clapped. Another joined. Then another. Until the hall filled with a fragile, uncertain applause, the sound of people remembering they had hands for something other than labor. Finch leaned close and whispered, Is this real? Or am I dreaming on a full stomach? Edwin smiled faintly. Maybe both. As dusk fell, the volunteers laid out extra blankets. No one was turned away. Even those without pennies were given a place on the floor, near the stove where warmth pooled like mercy. Edwin lay beside Finch, listening to the soft breathing around them. It didn't sound like a shelter. It sounded like a lullaby. He thought of the coffin house, the rope, the riots, all the ways London punished survival. And here, somehow, was a single room that did not. Tell me, if you were there, would you believe it? Could you trust kindness after so many nights of cruelty? Would you dare to close your eyes without fear? Finch was already asleep, one hand clutching his empty bowl as if afraid it might disappear. Edwin watched the firelight dance across the ceiling and felt something new stir within him. Not quite hope, not yet faith, but the quiet, cautious beginning of both. The next morning came softly. No bells, no orders, no boots on stone. Just the slow bloom of light through high windows, turning the gray air gold. For once, no one shouted. People stirred when they were ready, stretching like they'd forgotten what it meant to sleep through the night. Finch rubbed his eyes. We didn't get kicked out, he whispered, as though saying it too loud might break the spell. Edwin smiled. Seems not. Breakfast was porridge, real porridge, with milk and a bit of sugar. It tasted like memory, like something from before the streets. When they finished, a young woman entered the hall carrying a leather medical bag. Her steps were calm, her dress plain, but her presence drew every eye. That's Dr. Manning, one of the workers whispered. She volunteers for the captain. Comes twice a week. Finch frowned. A lady doctor? Thought that was against the rules. Most things worth doing are, Edwin murmured. Dr. Manning set her bag on a table and began seeing patients. Coughs, fevers, wounds from the cold. She treated each person with quiet attention, never rushing, never flinching at the smell or the dirt. When it was Edwin's turn, she looked up, meeting his eyes. Name? Edwin Hale. Printer, by the look of your hands, she said, noticing the faint ink stains still trapped beneath his nails. He nodded, surprised. Been a while, but yes. She listened to his chest, her stethoscope cold against his skin. The cough is bad, she said, but not hopeless. You need warmth, rest, and less smoke in your lungs. Her tone carried no judgment, only care. She handed him a small bottle. Laudanum mixed mild. For the pain and the cough. Use it sparingly. Edwin blinked. What do I owe? Dr. Manning smiled faintly. Nothing. You've already paid enough. He wasn't sure if she meant money or life. Nearby, Finch watched her work with wide eyes. When his turn came, he tried to hide his chapped hands and the cut on his arm from rummaging through refuse. She saw both immediately. Hold still, she said, cleaning the wound. He winced. Does it hurt? She asked. A bit. Good, she said softly. Means you're still alive. Finch stared at her as if she just told him something unbelievable. Do you ever get tired of it? He asked. Helping people who can't pay? She tied the bandage neatly. Never of helping. Sometimes of watching the world forget why it should. Later that morning, as Dr. Manning packed her bag, Captain Wilson approached. Rough night by the river, he said quietly. A dozen frost cases. We'll have more before week's end. Dr. Manning nodded. I'll return tomorrow. She glanced at Edwin and Finch. Keep warm, both of you. And eat even when you don't want to. When she left, Finch whispered, She talks to us like we matter. You do, Edwin said. Finch shook his head. Not out there, we don't. Outside, the fog was rising again, thick with chimney smoke. The city was waking into its usual misery. But something had shifted in Edwin. A doctor who asked for nothing, a shelter that demanded no penance. It felt impossible, yet real. As they walked toward the market to scavenge for the day, Finch said, You think this'll last? The captain, the doctor, all of it? I don't know, Edwin replied. But it's proof that kindness can exist. That's something to hold on to. Tell me, do you believe that? That kindness can survive in the coldest places? That mercy can grow in the cracks of a city built on smoke and profit? Or do you think, like so many, that compassion is just another luxury for those who can afford it? That night, when they returned to the shelter, Dr. Manning's voice still echoed in Edwin's mind. You've already paid enough. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The firelight flickered across Finch's sleeping face. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river moaned like an old wound, and the city coughed in its sleep. But inside Captain Wilson's shelter, for the first time, Edwin felt something he had almost forgotten. Not warmth, not safety, something deeper. A fragile, impossible faith in people. In the idea that maybe the world could change, one room, one doctor, one act of mercy at a time. The next morning, the fog carried a different smell. Less of the river, more of industry. Captain Wilson stood near the shelter door, coat buttoned high, a folded paper in hand. Good news, he said softly. A paper mill on Commercial Road needs workers. No references required. 6 shillings a week. Edwin blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. Work meant warmth, food, maybe even rent. Finch, standing beside him, whispered, 6 shillings? That's more than I've ever seen at once. Wilson smiled faintly. Report at dawn tomorrow. And remember, dignity doesn't end at the factory gates. The words followed them long after he left. That evening, Finch practiced standing straight, rehearsing how he'd speak to the foreman. Edwin watched him with quiet amusement. Never worked a day in your life, have you? Not a proper one, Finch said. But I can carry, sort, run. I'm fast. Just stay that way, Edwin murmured. Factories eat the slow. The next day they joined 9 others walking east. The city changed as they went. Streets widening, buildings turning from stone to brick, the air thickening with soot. By the time they reached the paper mill, smoke hung over the roof like a second sky. Inside, the noise hit like a living thing. The grinding of gears, the slap of wet pulp, the hiss of steam. Men and women moved with mechanical rhythm, their faces gray with dust. A foreman, red-faced and sharp-eyed, looked them over like livestock. New lot, he barked. You, printer? He pointed at Edwin, noting his ink-stained hands. Yes, sir. You'll sort rags. You boy, run errands, fetch and carry. Don't get in the way or you'll lose more than your wage. Finch nodded quickly. Yes, sir. The work began. Mountains of rags filled the sorting room, cotton, linen, wool, silk. Each had to be separated, cleaned, and shredded for pulp. The air was thick with lint that clung to skin and hair like spiderwebs. By midday, Edwin's hands were raw, his throat rasping from dust. Finch darted between tables, his quickness earning nods from older workers. At lunch, they shared a piece of bread between them, sitting on crates near a broken window. The air outside was barely cleaner than inside. Finch chewed slowly. Do you think this is what living feels like? Edwin smiled faintly. If it is, it's louder than I imagined. You think we'll keep it? The job. No, the chance. He didn't answer. Hope, he had learned, was as fragile as paper. It tore easily when handled too roughly. By dusk, their clothes were gray with pulp dust. The factory bell rang, releasing them into the street. Finch staggered a little, coughing. Edwin placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. You did well. Finch grinned weakly. I didn't drop a single bundle. Think they'll keep me? Of course. As they walked back toward the shelter, the city seemed different, still grim, still cold, but no longer entirely hopeless. The coins in Edwin's pocket felt heavier than gold. Inside Captain Wilson's hall, Dr. Manning was finishing her rounds. She looked up as they entered, smiling at the sight of soot-streaked faces. "First day?" she asked. "First week if we're lucky," Edwin replied. She nodded. "Eat well. Wash the dust when you can. That factory air steals lungs faster than hunger steals time." Later that night, lying on their mattresses, Finch whispered, "Do you think we'll ever have more than this? A job, a meal, a place to sleep?" Edwin turned to him. "More? Yeah, a home. A door that locks. A bed with sheets." He paused, almost embarrassed. "Someone who says goodnight." Edwin didn't answer right away. The fire cracked softly, throwing shadows across the ceiling. "You will," he said at last. "Maybe both of us will. Tell me, if you had nothing, would you still believe in more? Would you let hope survive even when everything around you teaches you not to? Or would you learn, as London did, to call survival enough?" The night outside was heavy with fog again. But inside the shelter, two hearts beat with a rhythm the city couldn't silence. The sound of work, of breath, of beginning again. The days at the paper mill blurred together, gray upon gray, until the hours lost their names. Edwin could measure time only by how black his hands grew each day, how the dust sank deeper into his lungs. The factory was alive in its own way, a metal beast that breathed steam and swallowed men. Finch, quick and restless, had become the favorite errand boy. He carried notes between foremen, fetched tea, ran along the conveyor lines like a spark in a coal mine. But by the third week, the spark began to dim. He coughed, lightly at first, then more often, a dry rasp that turned hollow. "You all right?" Edwin asked one morning as they walked to work. "Fine," Finch replied, forcing a grin. "Just the smoke. Everyone coughs." Edwin didn't argue. He remembered saying the same once before his own cough had learned to hurt. By midday, the boy's hands trembled. The foreman noticed. "Why, boy, you slowing down?" Finch nodded, eyes watering from the fumes. "Just the air, sir." "Then breathe faster," the man barked, laughter sharp as metal. No one else laughed. In the mill, weakness was contagious. That evening, Finch's cough deepened. At the shelter, Dr. Manning examined him by lamplight. Her expression was calm, but her hands moved quickly. "Bronchitis," she murmured. "Possibly pneumonia if it worsens." Finch tried to sit up. "Can I still work?" She pressed him gently back. "Not for now." He looked at Edwin, panic flickering behind bravado. "If I don't work, we can't stay." Captain Wilson stepped forward, his voice steady. "You'll stay. Work waits. Health does not." For the first time, Finch had no smart reply. He lay back, exhausted, as Dr. Manning mixed a tonic. Her voice softened. "Sleep. The lungs heal slow, but they do heal." That night, the shelter felt quieter than usual. Edwin sat near Finch's mattress, watching his small chest rise and fall. The firelight painted the boy's face in shades of amber and ash. Somewhere, a church bell marked 10, then 11. Every sound felt heavy. He thought of the factory's endless hum, the choking air, the grinding machines. He thought of the boy who had once played the reed pipe by the river. And he wondered, was this the cost of hope? To dream of something better only to be punished for reaching toward it? Tell me, have you ever felt that kind of cruelty? When every step forward invites another blow. When the moment you begin to hope, the world reminds you of your place. Would you still reach out again, knowing what it might take from you? Finch stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about bread and firelight. Edwin covered him with an extra blanket. He felt the boy's forehead, burning hot, slick with sweat. The next morning, Dr. Manning returned. "The fever's high," she said. "We'll move him near the stove." She looked at Edwin. "He trusts you. Stay with him if you can." "I will," Edwin said. Captain Wilson placed a hand on his shoulder. "You once asked what mercy looks like," he said quietly. "It looks like this, staying." Through that long day, Edwin sat beside Finch, listening to the city's muffled sounds beyond the brick walls. The clatter of carts, the distant cry of hawkers, the soft, endless cough of London itself. Every now and then, the boy would wake, eyes glazed with fever. "Are we still in the shelter?" he'd whisper. "Yes," Edwin would say. "You're safe." He didn't add for now. As evening fell, snow began to drift outside, swirling in the lamplight like ash. The shelter glowed from within, a fragile warmth against the endless cold. Dr. Manning passed by once more, checking Finch's pulse, adjusting his blanket. "He's strong," she said softly, "but strength has limits." Edwin looked down at the sleeping boy and nodded. "Yes," he whispered, "it does. And you, listening here, far from the soot and the silence, how do you measure strength? By what a body can endure? Or by the small mercies we refuse to stop giving, even when we know they won't change the world?" The night deepened. Finch's breathing steadied, the fever breaking at last. Dr. Manning smiled faintly. "He'll live," she said, as if granting permission to hope again. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless. A white silence settling over London, covering even the smoke. The fever broke with the dawn. When Finch opened his eyes, the world was pale and trembling, washed clean by snow. Light spilled through the high windows of Captain Wilson's shelter, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't gray, it was gold. "You slept 2 days straight," Edwin said softly. Finch blinked, voice hoarse. "2? Thought I'd slept through the century." He tried to sit up, coughing once, but the sound was no longer sharp, only tired. Dr. Manning appeared beside them, smiling gently. "He'll live," she said, "if he remembers that breathing is more important than working." Finch managed to grin. "I'll try to keep that in mind, miss." Outside, the snow was melting in slow, silver streams. The city's edges re-emerged, rooftops dripping, horses' hooves splashing in shallow puddles. The fog still lingered, but it had lost its bite. Even London seemed to exhale. That evening, the shelter buzzed with a quiet energy. The men mended shoes, the women folded laundry, children played near the stove. Captain Wilson walked among them, speaking softly to each. He carried no sermon, only questions. "Have you eaten? Are you warm enough?" Simple words, but they felt like prayers. Edwin helped serve tea, his cough almost gone. When he returned to Finch's side, the boy was sitting upright, tracing patterns on the table with his finger. "You know," Finch said, "I think I'm getting too used to not dying." Edwin laughed. "A fine habit to keep." Dr. Manning joined them after her rounds, removing her gloves, her expression softer than usual. "The worst of the cold has passed," she said. "Spring will come soon." "Will it?" Finch asked. "Feels like London doesn't believe in spring." She looked at him thoughtfully. "It comes whether we believe or not. That's what makes it spring." The fire crackled behind them, and the smell of tea filled the hall. For a few quiet minutes, time seemed to hold its breath. It was the kind of moment London rarely allowed, simple, warm, human. Outside, faint church bells marked 6 o'clock. Dr. Manning gathered her things. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "And if either of you so much as sneeze, I'll know." Finch saluted playfully. "Yes, doctor." When she left, he turned to Edwin. "Do you think people like her are real?" "What do you mean?" "She helps everyone. Doesn't ask for money or thanks. It's like she's from a different world." Edwin smiled faintly. "Maybe she's what this world could be, if it remembered how. Tell me, have you ever met someone like that? Someone who reminded you the world could be kind, even after you stopped expecting it? What did it change in you? Or did you just tuck it away like a small light you only dare look at when the dark feels too big?" Later that night, Finch couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing around him. "Edwin." "Yes." "You think the captain and the doctor ever get tired? Of trying to fix things that never stay fixed?" Edwin thought for a long moment. "Maybe. But maybe they just learned that trying is the fixing." Finch rolled onto his side, silent for a while. Then he said softly, "When I get better, I'll help them. Not just work for money, help like they do. Maybe that's what living's supposed to be." Edwin looked at him, the flicker of the stove reflecting in the boy's dark eyes. "That's a fine plan," he said. "A good one to grow into." In the days that followed, Finch regained strength quickly. By the week's end, he was sweeping floors again, humming through his reed pipe whenever Dr. Manning passed by. The shelter began to feel like a small village, fragile but alive. Men found jobs through Wilson's connections. Women began sewing cooperatives. Children learned their letters on borrowed slates. One evening, as Edwin stepped outside for air, he saw the last of the snow melting into the gutters, the water running clear. The smell of smoke still lingered, but beneath it was something faintly sweet, the scent of earth remembering the sun. He closed his eyes and listened. Far off, a factory bell rang, but its sound no longer felt like a chain. It was just another piece of the city's endless rhythm. Beside him, Finch appeared, hands in pockets. "Feels like London's waking up," he said. "It is," Edwin replied. "So are we. And you, can you feel that too? That slow, fragile thaw inside you. When the world, against all odds, decides to keep going. For London, spring was never promised. But it always came. And when it did, it brought with it something rarer than warmth. The quiet, stubborn miracle of surviving long enough to see it. The thaw came fast that year. By late March, the Thames was moving again, carrying slush and broken bits of winter downstream. Children splashed in puddles, traders returned to the markets, and the city, hungry for life, stirred from its long gray sleep. At Captain Wilson's shelter, laughter was no longer a stranger. The men joked over tea. Finch, now fully recovered, helped Sister Mary with deliveries. Edwin had returned to the factory, sorting rags beneath the wide, wheezing ceiling fans. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like a rumor. But progress in London was never gentle. It began as a whisper. A broken pipe, a faulty valve, the kind of thing no one notices until it screams. On a Wednesday afternoon, while Edwin worked near the shredding vats, the machine beside him coughed, metal grinding against metal. "Steam pressure's wrong," muttered the foreman. "Keep working. It'll clear." It didn't. The sound came first, a deep, rising groan like the earth itself protesting. Then a sudden hiss. Then silence. And then the explosion. The blast tore through the factory floor, scattering rags and splinters like snow. A wall of steam and heat slammed Edwin backward, knocking the breath from his lungs. For a moment there was no sound, only a white roar filling the world. When it cleared, the room was smoke and screams. People stumbled through the haze, faces streaked with soot and blood. The air stank of burnt oil and paper pulp. Edwin pushed himself up, ears ringing. Where Finch should have been, by the door helping unload, there was only debris. "Finch," he shouted, voice cracking. "Finch." No answer. Only the hiss of broken pipes and the low moan of fire. He moved through the smoke, calling again and again. At last, near the shattered window, he saw a small hand gripping the edge of a fallen beam. "Hold on," Edwin shouted. He tried to lift the beam, his fingers slipping on the wet ash. Others joined, workers coughing, faces ghost-like in the steam. Together they heaved, and the beam shifted just enough for Edwin to pull Finch free. The boy was breathing barely. Blood matted his hair, his chest rising shallowly. "Stay with me," Edwin whispered. "You hear? Just stay." Outside chaos reigned. Horses bolted, smoke curled into the sky, bells clanged from every direction. The paper mill, the city's proud machine of progress, had turned into a furnace. They carried Finch through the streets to Captain Wilson's shelter. Dr. Manning was already there, summoned by the sirens. When she saw them, she didn't waste a second. "Here," she said, guiding Edwin to a table near the stove. "Lay him down." Her hands moved quickly, bandaging, checking pulse, cutting away burned cloth. Finch stirred once, whispering something. Edwin leaned closer. "What is it? Did we finish the shift?" Edwin almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. "You did more than finish." The hours that followed blurred into candlelight and whispers. Dr. Manning worked tirelessly, Captain Wilson moving quietly behind her, fetching what she needed. When at last she stepped back, her face was pale. "He'll live," she said softly. "But the lungs, the smoke." Her voice faltered. "He'll need rest, months of it. No more factory." Edwin nodded, though the words cut deep. Work was survival, but so was Finch. The boy slept, his breathing thin but steady. Around them, the shelter was quiet, save for the low murmur of prayers and the crackle of the fire. "Tell me, if it were you, what would you choose? The work that feeds you, or the heart that keeps you human? How much can a man give before he becomes the thing he's fighting against? Another cog, another gear in London's endless machine?" As dawn crept in, Captain Wilson stood by the window, watching the smoke rise from the factory district. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "They'll call it an accident. But it's the same old story, machines breaking, men paying the price." Edwin didn't answer. He was holding Finch's hand, feeling the pulse flicker beneath his fingers. Outside, the city carried on. Carts rolled. Bells tolled. By noon, the paper mill was already being cleared for repair, because progress, like winter, always returned. Inside the shelter, however, time moved slower. Dr. Manning replaced the bandages, Captain Wilson offered tea, and Edwin watched the boys sleep, knowing that whatever the world called progress, for them it came with a cost too high to name. 3 days after the explosion, the city forgot. The newspapers printed a short column. Industrial mishap, 3 dead, several injured. Factory to resume operations shortly. No names, no faces, just progress continuing, neat as type on paper. Captain Wilson folded the article in silence. Behind him, the shelter was quiet. Dr. Manning tending to the wounded, Edwin sitting beside Finch, whose breathing still rasped like the whisper of torn cloth. 3 dead, Wilson said softly. I counted 9. Dr. Manning didn't look up. Names? They didn't bother to ask. Outside, the fog had returned, yellow, heavy, and mercifully dull. It covered the city's wounds like a shroud. But inside the shelter, grief had form. A missing man's boots by the door. A coat with no owner. The silence of beds that would not be filled again. That evening, Wilson gathered everyone in the hall. The fire burned low, the air still. We'll hold a service tomorrow, he said. Not official, but real. A murmur of assent passed through the room. The poor, after all, buried their own. The next morning, they carried the names that no one else would. Wilson read them from a slip of paper, each syllable heavy as stone. Edwin stood beside Finch, who leaned weakly against him. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes were fierce. They deserve more than this, he whispered. They will get it, Wilson said quietly. In time. The burial ground lay on the city's edge, where the earth was cheap and full of forgotten bones. The graves were shallow, marked with rough wooden crosses. The air smelled of damp soil and smoke. Wilson spoke plainly, his voice steady. These were men and women of labor. They built the city that will never remember them. Dr. Manning bowed her head. Finch clutched Edwin's hand. No choir sang, no priest blessed the ground. Only the wind moved, low and slow, through the crooked rows of the dead. Edwin thought of the factory's noise, the endless rhythm of rags and gears, and how quickly life there could vanish. One burst of steam, one turn too slow. Now here, everything was silent. Too silent. Tell me, what does a name mean when no one speaks it? What is remembrance worth when it lives only in the hearts of the forgotten? Would you still build a world that trades breath for progress? After the service, Wilson lingered at the graves. The papers will move on, he said. But I won't. He turned to Edwin. I'm meeting with the factory owners tomorrow. They'll hear what happened, from someone who was there. Edwin hesitated. They won't listen. Maybe not, Wilson said. But silence is worse. That night, back at the shelter, the atmosphere was heavy but alive. People spoke softly over tea, remembering those lost. Finch, still weak, sat by the fire, his hands trembling. I should have been one of them, he said. Edwin shook his head. You're here. That's what matters. The boy looked at him, voice small. Then I have to make it mean something. Dr. Manning overheard. Meaning doesn't come from surviving, she said gently. It comes from what you do once you have. The words hung in the air, warm and aching. Outside, rain began to fall, a slow, steady drizzle that softened the edges of the world. The kind of rain London understood best. Quiet, endless, heavy with memory. Edwin stepped out to feel it on his face. Each drop was cold but clean. In the distance, the factory chimney stood rebuilt, its smoke rising again as if nothing had happened. He watched it for a long time, the rain washing soot from his hair. Progress had resumed. The machines were turning. But beneath that rhythm, another pulse beat. Slower, human, unyielding. The pulse of all who refused to be erased. He thought of the graves, the nameless dead, the price already paid. Then he thought of Finch, pale but alive. Of Wilson's quiet defiance. Of Dr. Manning's hand steady even in exhaustion. And you, what would you have done? Walked away from the graves, letting the fog swallow them like everyone else? Or stayed, watching, remembering, refusing to let them vanish twice? First in death, then in silence? Edwin whispered to the rain. I'll remember them. The city didn't answer. But the wind carried his words anyway. Down the alleys, across the river, through the streets where progress marched on. and into the soil where names no longer mattered, only the echo of their lives. Captain Wilson left the shelter early, coat buttoned tight against the wind. London was awake in its usual hurry, horses clattering, chimneys coughing black. He carried no Bible, no protest sign, only a folded letter of the dead. Each name written in his careful hand, each one forgotten by everyone else. Edwin watched him go from the doorway. "Will they listen?" he asked. Wilson smiled faintly. "The powerful always listen. They just don't always care." Then he stepped into the fog and was gone. The meeting took place at the factory office on Commercial Road, a tall brick building that smelled of ink and ambition. Inside, everything gleamed: mahogany desks, brass railings, portraits of men who had never lifted a crate in their lives. The boardroom was crowded with smoke and indifference. 5 men in waistcoats sat behind a long table, their fingers tapping impatiently. The chairman, Mr. Pritchard, gestured with his cigar. "Captain Wilson, I understand you wish to discuss the unfortunate incident at our mill." Wilson stood straight, his cap in hand. "Yes. I wish to discuss the lives lost, and the conditions that caused it." "Caused?" Pritchard raised an eyebrow. "It was an accident." Wilson unfolded the letter. 9 dead. I have their names here. The youngest was 17. The oldest, 53. None were named in your report. The room shifted uneasily. One of the directors cleared his throat. "Our records list only 3 casualties." Wilson's voice did not rise, but it sharpened. "Then your records lie." Silence followed. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent as ever. Another man leaned back in his chair. "Captain, with respect, we employ hundreds. Accidents are inevitable. Machines break. Workers err. The best we can do is repair, rebuild, and carry on." "Repair?" Wilson repeated. "You mean rebuild the walls, not the people." Pritchard exhaled smoke. "The people, Captain, are replaceable. The machines are not." Wilson looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "That is why your machines will outlive you. Tell me, if you had stood there, would you have spoken? Would you have risked your place, your comfort, just to tell men like these the truth? Or would you have kept silent, the way the city teaches us to, and called it wisdom?" The meeting stretched on. Wilson argued not for charity but for dignity: shorter hours, clean air, fair pay. The men listened with the expression of those waiting for a storm to pass. When he finished, Pritchard stubbed out his cigar. "You have a good heart, Captain," he said. "But the world runs on profit, not pity." Wilson nodded once. "So it does. Until the day it breaks." He turned to leave. At the door, he paused and added softly, "When it does, remember the names you refused to learn." Outside, the wind carried the factory's familiar smell: smoke and pulp and hot iron. Wilson stood for a moment, staring at the chimney that still bled gray into the sky. Progress, they called it. He wondered what word would come after. When he returned to the shelter, Edwin and Finch were waiting by the fire. The captain's face was calm, but his hands trembled slightly. "They listened," he said. "But they won't act." Dr. Manning looked up from her desk. "Then we act." She placed a folded paper before him. A petition, already signed by workers from 3 mills. "Health reforms, air inspections, safety standards," she said. "The law ignores the poor, Captain. But the press doesn't." Finch leaned forward. "You mean we'll tell the papers?" Manning nodded. "If they won't give us justice, we'll give them shame." Wilson's eyes softened. "You're braver than most politicians, Doctor." "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm angry. There's a difference." That night, they sat together planning their next steps. The shelter, once a haven for rest, became a place of quiet resistance. Edwin copied the petition in neat, careful letters, his printer's hands remembering the rhythm of ink and truth. Finch sealed the envelopes, his fingers still bandaged but steady. When it was done, Wilson looked at them both. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start a different kind of work. And you, if you were there, would you have signed your name? Even knowing it might cost you your job, your bed, your safety? Would you fight for a justice you might never see? Or would you have turned away, telling yourself it was never your battle to begin with?" The fire burned low. Outside, the fog rolled thick over the Thames, but inside the shelter, light lingered, soft, stubborn, and unafraid. It was not the light of victory, but of people who refused to let the dark decide who they were. Morning came gray and damp, The kind of London day where fog and smoke were impossible to tell apart. Yet inside Captain Wilson's shelter, something had changed. The air hummed, not with fear but with purpose. Sheets of paper covered the tables, rows of names scrawled in uneven hands. Dr. Manning moved between them, collecting signatures. "Each name," she said softly, "is a witness." Finch nodded, his arms still in a sling. "Then let's make sure London can't look away." They called it the Paper Crusade. A petition, yes, but also a testament, an act of quiet rebellion written in ink and resolve. It demanded what Parliament ignored: safe factories, inspections, medical access for the poor. Nothing radical, only mercy written down. By noon, they had hundreds of signatures: dock workers, seamstresses, street sweepers, even a few policemen who signed quickly when no one was looking. Wilson sealed each sheet in wax, addressing the first bundle to the London Gazette. Edwin, whose fingers once sorted rags, now handled truth like a craftsman. He copied, folded, and stamped with care. "You used to print their lies," Finch teased. "Now you're printing ours." Edwin smiled faintly. "No, we're printing what they've forgotten to see. Tell me, if you had nothing but a pen and a name, would you use it to challenge a city? Would you risk being erased just to leave a mark that might last longer than your hunger?" That afternoon, Dr. Manning and Edwin carried the petitions across the city. Rain fell in slow needles, the cobblestones slick with soot. At the newspaper office, the clerk barely glanced up. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing their threadbare clothes. "Testimonies," Manning said, her voice level. "From the people your readers pretend don't exist." The clerk frowned, but something in her tone, steady, educated, unafraid, made him take the bundle. We'll pass it to the editor," he muttered. They left without waiting for thanks. By evening, they returned soaked but alight with energy. Finch met them at the door, eyes bright. "Did they take it?" "Yes," Edwin said. "Whether they print it is another matter." Wilson poured tea into cracked cups. "They will," he said. "Truth has a way of leaking through even the thickest paper." He was right. 3 days later, a column appeared in the London Gazette. Not front page, not yet, but enough. "Workers speak, voices from the East End." Beneath the headline, the petition's words spread like quiet fire. Quotes from the dead, names of the forgotten, descriptions of the fourpenny coffins, the rope shelters, the children sleeping among rats. It was the first time in years that the city's wealthier half was forced to read about the other half. Letters to the editor flooded in, some praising, others furious. Factory owners called it slander. Churchmen called it dangerous. But the poor, they called it hope. By week's end, copies of the article were being passed hand to hand in markets, on docks, and taverns. Someone had drawn a crude symbol in charcoal on the back. 2 hands clasped, ink dripping between them. The Paper Crusade. Wilson looked at one of the reprints, smiling faintly. "Do you see?" he asked Edwin. "This is how revolutions begin. Not with guns, but with words the world can't unhear." Finch, leaning on a crutch now, nodded. "And with people who refuse to stay quiet." But not everyone shared their faith. That night, a messenger arrived, a thin boy with fear in his eyes. "Captain," he whispered, handing Wilson a folded note. It was from the factory board. "A libel suit will be filed if your statements continue. Cease all publications immediately." Wilson read it twice, then passed it to Dr. Manning. She exhaled slowly. "They're scared." "Good," Wilson said. "Fear means they've started listening." Edwin stared into the fire. "They could shut us down." "They could," Wilson agreed. "But they can't shut down the truth." The next morning, he pinned the Gazette article to the shelter's door. Rain had blurred the ink slightly, but the message still shone through. A crowd gathered, workers, mothers, children, all reading in silence. For once, London's poor saw themselves printed, not pitted. "Tell me, when you hear the truth, do you hide from it or hold it close? Would you risk comfort for conscience or wait for someone braver to move first?" That night, Wilson wrote a final entry in his journal. "We have built something fragile but alive. A voice for those who were never meant to speak. If it's silenced tomorrow, at least it spoke once, and that's enough to echo." Outside, the fog thickened again, swallowing the gaslights one by one. But in the shelter's window, a single lamp still burned. Small, steady, defiant, like a promise written in flame. The rain had been falling since dusk, thin, bitter, endless. Inside Captain Wilson's shelter, the lamps burned low, casting amber halos across the sleeping hall. Dozens of bodies breathed in rhythm, a fragile chorus of the forgotten. Edwin sat by the window, copying names by candlelight, signatures for the next round of petitions. Finch dozed beside the fire, his crutch leaning against the wall. Dr. Manning was still awake, her hands trembling slightly as she packed medical supplies into a wooden box. "Just in case," she murmured. Wilson looked up from his journal. "You sense it too?" She nodded. "The city's too quiet." Outside, the fog hid movement until it was too late. Boots splashed through puddles. A low command cut through the rain. Then knocking. Artificial. The kind of knock that never asked permission. Wilson rose. "Open the door," he told Edwin quietly. "Better they find no fear here." The door swung open to reveal 5 uniformed men, their helmets glinting like wet stone. The leader stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Captain Wilson," he announced, "by order of the Metropolitan Police, this establishment is to be searched. You are under suspicion of sedition and unlawful assembly." The room stirred, sleepers waking, whispers swelling like wind before a storm. Finch gripped his crutch. "Sedition?" he repeated. "For feeding the poor?" The officer's gaze flicked to him. "For inciting unrest." Wilson's voice was calm. "We teach no violence here." "You teach discontent," the officer replied. "And that's enough. Tell me, if kindness were declared a crime, would you still practice it? If mercy became rebellion, would you still offer it to the world?" The police fanned out, overturning benches, opening cupboards, scattering papers. One seized the stack of petitions. "What's this?" he sneered. "Words," Edwin said quietly. "Dangerous ones, apparently." Another officer kicked over the box of supplies, glass vials shattering against the floor. Dr. Manning flinched as the smell of alcohol and medicine filled the air. Wilson stepped between her and the officer. "Enough. This is a shelter, not a cell." The leader's jaw tightened. "Then perhaps you should have acted like one." They arrested him first. No struggle, no raised voice, just the clink of chains in the dark. Edwin moved forward instinctively, but Wilson shook his head. "Stay with them," he whispered. "They'll need you." As they dragged him toward the door, Finch limped after them. "You can't take him. He's done nothing." An officer shoved him aside. The boy fell, hitting the stone floor with a cry. Dr. Manning rushed to his side, fury in her voice. "Is this your justice?" The officer hesitated, but only for a moment. "Orders are orders." Outside, the rain turned heavier, drumming on tin and cobblestone. Wilson was pushed into a carriage, his hands bound. Before the door slammed, he caught Edwin's eye through the downpour. "Don't let the light go out," he said softly. Then he was gone. Inside, chaos lingered like smoke. Papers torn. Shelves overturned. But the lamp by the window still burned. Dr. Manning stood slowly, her dress soaked with spilled medicine. "They'll come back," she said. "For the rest of us." Edwin nodded, his face pale. "Then we have until morning." Through the night they worked. Finch gathered what papers remained, smoothing out creases, wiping mud from the signatures. Edwin rewrote what had been torn. Dr. Manning tended to the injured, her sleeves rolled, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The storm outside raged, but inside, the shelter held. Each sound of thunder was met with another scratch of pen on paper. The act of resistance continuing, quiet but unbroken. At dawn, the rain stopped. The sky over Whitechapel glowed faintly blue-gray, the color of spent fire. The shelter was a ruin, but it was alive. Wilson's chair sat empty by the hearth, his journal open to the last line he'd written. "If they silence one voice, let another rise. If they break our walls, build with the pieces." Finch traced the words with his fingers. "What do we do now?" Edwin looked toward the window where the light seeped in. "We keep writing." He lifted the pen again, ink still wet from the night's labor. Outside, the first carriage wheels began to roll, the city returning to its indifferent routine. But within that forgotten corner of London, rebellion took shape not in shouts or fire, but in the quiet insistence of those who refused to vanish. "And you, would you have stayed when the police came? Would you have guarded the light or hidden from the storm?" Sometimes, history turns not on battles or kings, but on those who decide that even silence will not erase what must be said. The last words of the night still lingered in the air. like a promise whispered to the dawn. Don't let the light go out. Cold Harbor Prison sat by the river, a squat stone beast breathing damp into the bones of everyone inside. By day, it echoed with footsteps and coughs. By night it whispered. Captain Wilson slept on a straw pallet, a single blanket for mercy. The cell was narrow enough that he could touch both walls with outstretched hands. When the warder slid bread and water through the slot, he always said the same words. No preaching. But Wilson had never needed a pulpit to speak. He found paper scraps from the prison chapel, rejected sermon notes, and began to write letters. Not to officials, not to God. To the people he'd left behind. To Edwin. The world outside these walls is still the same fog and noise, I imagine. But don't let its indifference harden you. The poor are not weak, they're simply tired. Keep the shelter open if you can. If they close it, keep the idea alive somewhere, even if it's only in your mind. To Dr. Manning, forgive me for leaving you to fight alone. But perhaps you understand what it means now, to heal where the wound never closes. You said anger can build if it's guided. Guide it well. Don't let bitterness steal your kindness. That's what they want, to prove compassion cannot last. He wrote until his fingers cramped. Each night the same sound. Ink scratching, rats moving, the soft hum of the Thames through the window bars. Tell me, if you were caged for mercy, would you still write about hope? If the world punished you for kindness, would you still believe in it? The letters reached the shelter through hidden channels. A sympathetic guard, a baker's wife, a parish courier who remembered the captain's sermons. When Edwin unfolded the first one, his hands shook. Dr. Manning read it aloud by lamplight. Finch listened, eyes wide, as though hearing a story from another world. It doesn't sound like a prisoner, the boy whispered. No, Edwin said softly. It sounds like freedom. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, copies of Wilson's letters began appearing across London. Some printed anonymously in penny papers, others handwritten and passed between factory workers like relics. Each carried the same refrain. If compassion is weakness, let us be weak together. The phrase became a whisper on the wind, painted on alley walls, murmured in markets. A quiet defiance that even fog couldn't smother. Inside Cold Harbor, Wilson learned of it from a guard who leaned close one evening and said, "They're quoting you in the papers, Captain." Wilson smiled faintly. "Then the walls are doing their job. They keep me in, but they can't keep the truth out." Still, the nights grew longer. His cough deepened in the cold. He counted time not by days, but by visits of light through the high-barred window. He began a new letter, unfinished, meant for no one in particular. They believe prisons silence ideas, but stone walls only echo them back louder. The poor will not always whisper. One day they will speak, and the world will have to listen. He folded it neatly, pressing it into the crack beneath the floorboard. For someone, someday. At the shelter, winter returned. The lamps flickered with weaker oil. Edwin kept the fire burning using scraps from the factory. Wood too warped for crates, paper too ragged for packaging. Dr. Manning's eyes were hollow from exhaustion, but she refused to close the door to anyone. "We're still here," she told every newcomer. "Still here and still believing." Finch, his limp worse from the cold, carried soup to the sick in nearby alleys. He'd grown from boy to man in that season. His voice quieter but his resolve harder. One evening, as snow fell thick as silence, a stranger arrived with a sealed envelope stamped with the prison crest. Edwin's heart froze. Dr. Manning opened it carefully. It was short. Wilson's final words. "If I do not leave these walls, remember this. A shelter is not a building. It is a promise. Keep it alive in each act of kindness, and I will never truly be gone." The room stayed still for a long time after she read it. Then Finch rose, took the letter, and pinned it to the door beside the faded Gazette article. He whispered, "Now everyone will know where to find him. Tell me, when someone you admire is gone, do you mourn their absence or carry their work? When light dies, do you curse the dark, or do you learn to make your own flame?" That night, snow covered the roof of the shelter like a shroud. But from the street, passers-by could still see a glow behind the frosted windows. A single, steady light refusing to dim. The winter came early that year. Even the river seemed to freeze mid-breath. Factories shut down as coal ran scarce. Bread lines lengthened until they curved around entire blocks. And London, once the heart of empire, began to starve like any other city. At Captain Wilson's shelter, the oil in the lamps was nearly gone. They burned rags soaked in tallow, the smoke thick and greasy. The air stank of desperation, but it was warm. That was all that mattered. Dr. Manning kept the infirmary alive with stubborn faith. Her medicines were mostly gone, so she improvised: steam, herbs, salt water, prayer. When a child coughed, she whispered Wilson's words under her breath. A shelter is not a building. It is a promise. Outside, the snow was black with soot. Each flake carried ash from factory chimneys and the burning of cheap coal. People called it the Winter of Ashes, a season where light felt like memory. Edwin stood by the window one night, watching flakes fall through the lamplight. They said spring would come early, he murmured. Finch, older now, laughed dryly. They always say that. He stirred a pot of thin soup, water, bread ends, a single onion. It's enough, Edwin said quietly. It's never enough, Finch replied. Tell me, how much warmth would you share if you had almost none? Would you give your last bit of fire to another, knowing you might freeze? Despite the cold, people kept coming. Mothers with babies wrapped in newspapers. Men with frostbitten hands. Girls no older than 12, coughing blood onto handkerchiefs. Dr. Manning never turned them away. One night, a knock came, soft, hesitant. When Edwin opened the door, a man stood there in a thin coat, snow clinging to his beard. He looked half dead, but his eyes were alive. I'm told this is where Captain Wilson once preached, he said. Edwin nodded. It still is. The man reached into his coat and handed over a small folded sheet. On it, Wilson's handwriting. A copy of one of his prison letters, found pinned to a workhouse wall in Southwark. They've been passing these around, the man said. Factory hands, dock workers, even some clerks. They say he changed the way we think about mercy. He coughed, nearly collapsing. Edwin caught him by the shoulders. You're safe here. The man smiled weakly. I know. That's why I came. They laid him near the stove. Dr. Manning tried to save him, but it was too late. Exposure, starvation, both had taken their toll. He died before dawn, one more body in a winter that seemed determined to claim them all. Finch built the coffin himself out of scrap wood. As they buried the stranger in the frozen ground behind the shelter, Edwin read from Wilson's letter. If compassion is weakness, let us be weak together. The words froze in the air, then vanished into the white. Days blurred. The shelter became a city within a city, a republic of hunger, lit by candle ends and stubborn hope. Children played beside dying fires. Old men prayed to gods they no longer believed in. And through it all, Wilson's letters continued to spread. Someone, no one knew who, began printing them as a pamphlet. Mercy in the Smoke, it was called. Cheap paper, black ink, sold for a farthing or passed for free. They appeared everywhere, in bakeries, at factory gates, even on church pews. The authorities called it dangerous. But danger, it seemed, had already claimed the city. What could fear threaten that starvation hadn't already taken? One morning, Finch returned from the market with frost on his hair and tears frozen on his cheeks. They're burning them, he said. The pamphlets. Whole stacks. Edwin took his hand. Then we'll print more. With what? With whatever's left. That night, they melted candle stubs for wax, inked old pages, and pressed words into paper by hand. Wilson's words breathing again through their fingers. Tell me, what would you do for an idea that refuses to die? Would you risk your safety for something that can't feed you, can't clothe you, can't promise tomorrow, only meaning? By February, the snow turned gray, the streets black with thaw. Disease followed, typhus, influenza, worse. Dr. Manning barely slept. Each morning she buried another body. Each night she lit another lamp. Finch collapsed one afternoon while carrying firewood. When he woke, she sat beside him, exhausted but smiling. You'll live, she said. But you're not allowed to be a martyr yet. He grinned faintly. That's Captain Wilson's job. No, she whispered, it's all of ours now. And in that moment, under a roof patched with frost and faith, they understood what Wilson had meant all along. A shelter is not a place, it's the act of refusing to turn away. Outside, the last snow of the season began to fall, so black with soot that it looked like ash. It blanketed London's roofs, chimneys, graves, and then slowly, softly began to melt. The thaw had begun. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came like forgiveness, hesitant, uncertain, but real. The snow withdrew slowly from the rooftops, leaving behind rivers of soot and memory. For the first time in months, the air carried something other than smoke. At Captain Wilson's shelter, the fires burned lower but steadier. There were fewer coughs now, fewer funerals. Dr. Manning could finally step outside without her breath freezing in midair. She stood in the courtyard, eyes closed, listening to the drip of melting ice, the quiet sound of survival. Edwin joined her, carrying a mug of tea that had gone cold. "Strange," he said softly. "The silence feels louder now." She smiled faintly. "That's because it's no longer fear. It's peace." Inside, Finch was helping hang laundry between beams, the damp cloths fluttering like surrender flags. He had grown taller that winter. His face thinner, older, marked by more than hunger, by purpose. The world outside had changed too. Not much, but enough. Newspaper boys shouted headlines that didn't sound like mockery anymore. Factory inquiry launched. MP quotes prison letters in Commons. When Edwin bought a copy, the ink smeared his fingers. He didn't care. He read aloud. "The recent circulation of writings by one Captain Edward Wilson has prompted questions in Parliament regarding the treatment of London's poor. Though controversial, his words have stirred significant public sympathy." Finch blinked. "They said his name." "They said his name," Edwin repeated, smiling like someone hearing music after years of noise. "Tell me, how long must a man be gone before the world begins to hear him? And if justice comes too late for the living, is it still justice or only memory dressed as mercy?" By April, letters began to arrive. From clergymen, journalists, even a few politicians. Some offered donations, others visits, but most simply wrote the same words. "Captain Wilson changed how we see the poor." Dr. Manning read each one aloud in the evening, as though reading scripture from a new gospel. Every signature, every seal felt like a resurrection. One afternoon, a carriage arrived outside the shelter. A young man in a tailored coat stepped down, carrying a small wooden box. "Are you the ones who ran this place?" he asked. Edwin nodded warily. The man opened the box. Inside lay Wilson's Bible, edges frayed, cover worn smooth by use. "They found it in his cell," the man said quietly. He asked that it be returned here should anything happen to him. Dr. Manning took it with trembling hands. She brushed dust from the cover and read the inscription on the first page. "To whoever carries the light next." No name, no date, just those words. That night, they placed the Bible on the mantel beside the old Gazette article and the final letter from Cold Harbor Prison. Together, they looked less like relics and more like a roadmap. The record of people who refused to forget compassion, even when it hurt. Finch lit the evening lamp. The flame caught slowly, uncertain, then steadied. "I used to think this place was small," he said. "Now it feels like the center of the world." Dr. Manning smiled. "Because hope doesn't need space, only endurance." Outside, London was changing in small, invisible ways. A factory on the docks introduced shorter shifts for its workers. A church in Spitalfields opened its doors for shelter at night. A doctor in Clerkenwell began treating the poor for free on Sundays. No one credited Captain Wilson directly, but his words had become the quiet conscience of a city. "Tell me, do you believe change begins with law or with kindness? Which lasts longer, a speech in Parliament or a single act of mercy repeated 1,000 times?" One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Edwin sat by the window, writing in Wilson's journal. Not as a preacher, not as a savior, just as a witness. "We survived the winter," he wrote. "We carried his light even when it flickered. And now London begins to thaw. Maybe not in its streets, not yet, but in its heart." He closed the book and set it beside the lamp. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to stay awake to guard the flame. It would burn on its own now. Outside, a breeze carried the scent of river water and lilacs from the south. The Thames, once frozen and gray, moved again, slow, steady, alive. And somewhere in the city, a child recited Wilson's words aloud in school, not knowing who had written them, only that they felt true. The Thames was moving again. Slow, brown, alive, carrying fragments of winter out to sea. From the bridge, Edwin watched the current twist around the arches like smoke reborn as water. "Funny," Finch said beside him, leaning on his crutch. "The river looks cleaner than I remember." Edwin nodded. Or maybe we're just seeing clearer. Below them, barges drifted past, laden with coal, timber, and people chasing another chance at survival. The city had thawed, but it hadn't healed. Smoke still rose from the factories. Men still queued for bread. And yet, something was different. The silence had changed tone. At the shelter, a messenger had arrived that morning with an embossed envelope. The seal bore the insignia of the House of Commons. Dr. Manning read it twice before speaking. "They're requesting our attendance," she said. "A parliamentary committee on urban reform." Finch blinked. "Us." "Yes, Finch. Us." That afternoon, the three of them made their way across London. Through Whitechapel's narrow lanes, where children played with sticks and puddles. Through Fleet Street, where newsboys shouted the day's headlines. And finally to Westminster, the city's stone heart, polished and indifferent. They were escorted through corridors lined with portraits of men who'd never known hunger. In the chamber, the committee sat at a long oak table, papers stacked like fortifications. The chairman, an older man with silver hair and an unreadable expression, gestured for them to sit. Dr. Manning, Mr. Edwin Clark, and Mr. Finch. Finch swallowed. "Just Finch, sir." "Very well," the man said. "You represent the late Captain Wilson's shelter, yes?" Edwin inclined his head. "We carry his work." The chairman shuffled through his notes. "You've submitted letters, petitions if you will, on the treatment of the city's poor. They've gained attention." Another member interrupted. "Controversy, you mean?" "Indeed," the chairman agreed. "But also admiration." Dr. Manning met his gaze. "We didn't write for admiration, sir. We wrote because people were dying unseen." The room fell still. For a moment, even the ticking clock seemed to hesitate. Edwin took out Wilson's worn Bible and placed it gently on the table. "This belonged to the man whose name you speak in Parliament," he said softly. "He asked that it be returned to whoever carried the light next. So here it is, back where it can do the most good." One of the younger MPs leaned forward, curious. "You believe compassion can be legislated, Mr. Clark?" Edwin smiled faintly. "No, but it can be recognized. Tell me, if you had the chance to speak before power, would you plead for the helpless, or would you accuse the comfortable? Would you bow, or would you remind them what they've forgotten?" Dr. Manning opened one of the pamphlets, Mercy in the Smoke, and began to read aloud. Wilson's words filled the chamber, quiet but unyielding. "If compassion is weakness, let us be weak together. Let our weakness build hospitals, feed the hungry, and remind the strong that strength without mercy is merely cruelty refined." When she finished, no one spoke. The chairman cleared his throat, visibly moved. "These letters," he said slowly, "have already done more than most speeches. But words need weight. What would you have this house do?" Edwin answered simply. "See us, not as mouths to feed, but as lives to trust. Start there." It wasn't a demand. It was an offering. Later, as they stepped back into the pale sunlight, Finch exhaled shakily. "Did we change anything?" Dr. Manning smiled, the corners of her eyes creasing. "Change never happens in the room you speak in. It happens in the rooms that hear about it after." By evening, they returned to the shelter. A crowd was waiting. Neighbors, factory hands, mothers clutching infants. Word had spread fast. Wilson's people had spoken in Parliament. Edwin stood by the doorway, unsure what to say. He didn't need to. The crowd began to sing, quietly at first, then stronger. A hymn Wilson had once taught them. "There is light in the smoke and mercy in the dust. The hands that build can also heal. And though the night remembers pain, the dawn remembers us." The sound carried out into the street, past the gas lamps, over the river, reaching corners of London where hope had forgotten its own name. "Tell me, have you ever heard a song rise from exhaustion? It's not loud. It's not perfect. But it's the sound of people remembering they are still alive." As the hymn faded, Dr. Manning looked up at the sky. The clouds had broken at last, revealing a thin, trembling strip of blue above the rooftops. The river reflected it like a mirror of forgiveness. London was far from healed, but for the first time in a generation it was listening. It began with a spark, not the kind that burns wood, but the kind that burns through silence. One cold Sunday afternoon, a group of dockworkers asked Dr. Manning to speak. They had gathered on the riverbank, hundreds of them, men and women in threadbare coats, children clutching bread crusts. all waiting beneath a sky the color of pewter. They wanted to hear about Captain Wilson, the man whose words had traveled from a prison cell to Parliament. Dr. Manning hesitated. "I'm not a preacher," she said. Edwin smiled. "That's what he used to say." Finch was already setting up a crate for her to stand on. "Then you'd better start." The crowd thickened, faces pale in the cold light. A few policemen watched from a distance but didn't interfere. The river moved slowly beside them, its surface shimmering with reflected firelight from torches someone had brought. Dr. Manning stepped up onto the crate. The murmur of voices faded until only the wind spoke. She began softly, her voice low and steady like the river itself. "London," she said, "has learned to build with iron and steam. But somewhere along the way, it forgot how to build with mercy." The crowd stilled. Even the seagulls seemed to circle slower. She spoke of Wilson, not as a saint but as a man who refused to stop caring. She told them of the shelter, of the night the police came, of the letters written in cold and darkness. And she read one aloud, Wilson's last words. "A shelter is not a building. It is a promise." When she finished, the riverbank was silent. Then someone shouted, "He was right." Another voice followed, rough and loud, "We're the proof." And then more, voices merging, rising like wind through dry reeds. Finch leaned close to Edwin, whispering, "Do you think he'd believe this if he saw it?" Edwin watched the crowd, eyes shining. "He did see it," he said quietly. "He just never lived long enough to stand here. Tell me, if the dead could hear us, would they feel pride or sorrow, knowing it took their suffering to make us finally listen?" Dr. Manning raised her hand and the noise softened. "There's something Captain Wilson once told me," she said. "He said kindness doesn't need permission. You don't have to wait for Parliament, or for the rich, or for the churches to tell you it's allowed. If you have a crust of bread, break it. If you have a voice, use it. If you have a heart, open it." The torches flickered, painting her face in gold and shadow. Behind her, the river caught the light, a mirror of fire stretching toward the city. "We've called this hunger. We've called it poverty. But it's not just about food or work. It's about remembering we belong to each other." The words fell like embers, catching in the hearts of those who heard. The crowd began to chant softly. First just a few voices, then hundreds, echoing Wilson's line from the letters. "If compassion is weakness, let us be weak together." The chant rolled through the streets, up toward the bridges, past the wharves where sailors paused to listen, and even into the grand stone halls of Westminster, where politicians stopped mid-conversation, wondering where that sound came from. The fire sermon, they would call it later. The day London's poor spoke in one voice, not in anger but in unity. As the chant swelled, Edwin noticed something strange. Policemen had lowered their batons. One was even mouthing the words silently. The sound was too human to fight. Tell me, have you ever seen a city hold its breath? When the noise stops and suddenly everyone knows they're alive together. When the sermon ended, no one moved for a long time. Then Finch stepped forward, took one of the torches and planted it in the ground. The flame burned steady against the wind. Others followed, one by one, until the entire riverbank shimmered with fire. Dr. Manning climbed down from the crate, exhausted but radiant. Edwin touched her shoulder. "You gave him his voice back," he said. She shook her head. "No, we gave it to each other." That night, London glowed, not from gas lamps or factory smoke, but from the hundreds of small fires burning beside the Thames. They weren't protests. They weren't riots. They were remembrance. The next morning, newspaper boys shouted the headline. "The poor light the river. No violence, no arrests, only hope." And beneath it in smaller print, the Wilson sermon, a call for compassion. For once, the city didn't look away. It leaned closer. Spring deepened into summer. And for the first time in living memory, London didn't smell of ash. The air still carried coal smoke, but beneath it was something gentler. Baking bread, blooming lilac, river wind. The city hadn't changed overnight, but it had started to breathe differently. The fire sermon had spread like the thawed river itself, slow, winding, unstoppable. Factories began installing safety valves. Workhouses opened infirmaries for the sick instead of turning them away. And on street corners, people spoke Wilson's words as if they were their own. "A shelter is not a building. It is a promise." Dr. Manning stood on the same riverbank where the crowd had gathered months before. Now, wildflowers had grown between the cobblestones, their roots drinking from the soil that once held footprints of the starving. Children played by the water's edge, their laughter scattering like birds into the sunlight. Finch sat on a bench nearby, carving a small cross out of driftwood. He'd lost his limp mostly, though he still used the crutch on long walks. "Strange," he said, "how the city looks softer now." Dr. Manning smiled. Maybe it always wanted to. Across the street, a group of women were setting up a new soup kitchen. Not run by the church, nor by the state, but by the people themselves. One of them had painted the sign by hand. Wilson House, warmth for all. Edwin arrived carrying a bundle of newspapers. He looked healthier these days, his eyes clearer, his shoulders steady. "Listen to this," he said, unfolding the front page. "Parliament passes the Social Relief Act. Establishes public shelters and medical aid for the poor." Finch whistled low. "They actually did it." Edwin nodded. "Piece by piece maybe, but it's a start. Tell me, when the world finally changes, do you feel joy for what's won? Or grief for what it cost?" They sat together, quiet for a while, watching the sunlight scatter on the water. Dr. Manning took out Wilson's Bible, now worn and patched with cloth. She opened it to the first page where he'd written, "To whoever carries the light next." And below it, she added in her careful script, "It was never ours alone." She closed the book and handed it to Edwin. "For the next generation," she said. He accepted it wordlessly, knowing some torches are too sacred to hold forever. Around them, life continued. Men unloaded crates from barges. Women laughed as they scrubbed clothes on the stones. The air rang not with sermons or protests, but with the small, steady sounds of people living as if mercy were normal. Even the newspapers had changed. Where once headlines screamed about riots and poverty, now they carried stories of reformed schools, and the strange new concept called social conscience. At dusk, the three of them walked to the bridge. The water caught the golden light like liquid glass. Finch leaned against the railing, eyes distant. "Do you think he'd be proud?" he asked. Dr. Manning didn't answer right away. Then she said softly, "He'd be relieved." Edwin smiled faintly. He never wanted statues, just decency. She looked at him. "And maybe that's the greater monument. Tell me, what kind of monument would you build for kindness? Would you raise stone, or simply live so that the kindness keeps building itself?" The wind picked up, carrying the sound of church bells from across the river. A barge drifted by, its lanterns glowing like slow stars. And for a fleeting moment, the reflection on the water looked like fire again. Gentle, eternal, alive. Finch broke the silence. "We should light a lamp tonight. For him." "We don't have to," Edwin said, watching the glowing sky. The whole city already did. As night fell, the lamps along the embankment flickered to life one by one. The same lamps that once illuminated hunger and despair. Now shone on clean streets, on workers walking home together, on the quiet dignity of people who'd learned to look after one another. And somewhere in the hum of the river, you could almost hear Wilson's voice again. Not preaching, not pleading, just reminding. Kindness outlives everything. The first morning of Wilson House smelled of soap and new paper. The building stood at the corner of Flower and Dean Street, where once there had been only mud, hunger, and the ghosts of old shelters. Now sunlight poured through wide windows, warming the freshly scrubbed floors and rows of second-hand desks. Finch unlocked the door at dawn, smiling as if opening a church. He had built most of the furniture himself. Every plank sanded smooth, every nail driven straight. Dr. Manning stood beside him, holding a box of chalk and medicine bottles. And Edwin carried the thing that mattered most, Wilson's worn Bible. Not for worship, but for memory. By midday, the first children arrived. Small, cautious, hungry-eyed. Some barefoot, some in coats too large for their shoulders. They looked around the bright room with disbelief, as if kindness itself might vanish if they moved too suddenly. Edwin knelt beside a boy clutching a broken slate. "You can write your name?" The boy shook his head. "Then we'll start there," Edwin said softly. "Everyone deserves a name." Within weeks, Wilson House filled with laughter and chalk dust. The old despair of the East End was still there, but it now lived beside something stronger, learning. Children read aloud from simple readers, their voices halting but proud. Dr. Manning taught them more than letters. How to wash a wound, how to share food, how to stand up straight when the world tells you to bow. Finch, who once begged for shelter himself, taught them how to build a chair, patch a roof, and use their hands for something more than survival. One afternoon, Edwin watched from the doorway as a little girl traced Wilson's words on the blackboard. A shelter is not a building. It is a promise. He felt the lump rise in his throat. The letters wobbled, chalk dusting her fingers like snow. She turned, smiling shyly. "Is that right, sir?" He nodded. "Perfectly. Tell me, what is the sound of hope being learned for the first time? Is it laughter? Or the scrape of chalk across a board, slow and determined as breathing?" Soon the place drew attention. Reporters visited, expecting chaos, but left writing about the House of Light, where orphans learned beside the children of dock workers, and where no one asked what you could pay. One article described it as a school for the human spirit. Donations followed, not from nobles or merchants, but from the people themselves. Pennies left on doorsteps, loaves of bread, bolts of cloth. Each gift anonymous, each one sacred. At dusk, after the children left, the three of them would sit by the open window, listening to the city settle. The river murmured somewhere beyond the alleys, its voice softer now, as if finally at peace. Finch leaned back in his chair, watching the lamplight flicker on the walls. "Do you think this will last?" he asked. Dr. Manning smiled. "As long as there's one child left to remember what this means." Edwin opened Wilson's Bible to the back page. There, in careful handwriting, he began to copy down the names of every student who passed through the doors. By the end of that year, there were nearly 100. By the next, 300. Each name, once invisible, now written in ink that would not fade. Tell me, what if immortality isn't statues or monuments, but names spoken by those who once had none? In time, other houses of light opened across London, in Bethnal Green, Limehouse, and Southwark. Some were schools, others clinics, others shelters that charged nothing at all. But each one bore the same inscription above the door: "Mercy in the Smoke." And though Captain Wilson's grave remained unmarked, his legacy grew roots deeper than any stone. Years later, a journalist asked Dr. Manning how she had turned one man's dream into a movement. She answered quietly, "He didn't build it, we did. He just taught us how to see each other again." The reporter wrote that line at the top of his article, and for weeks afterward, strangers came to Wilson House, not out of charity, but out of longing, for a world that remembered kindness as common sense. As evening fell, the last lamp in the classroom burned low. Edwin closed the journal of names and looked around the quiet room. The desks, the chalkboard, the smell of wood smoke. It all felt ordinary and yet eternal. He whispered to the dark, "Thank you, Captain. We kept the promise." Outside, the river shimmered under the moonlight, a long silver thread sewing the city's wounds together. And from somewhere downstream, a child's laughter carried across the water, bright and fearless. It was half a century later when the last of them, Edwin Clark, walked again by the Thames. The city looked nothing like the London of his youth. Gas lamps had turned to electric ones. Horses had vanished beneath the rumble of trams. And the air, though still gray, carried laughter instead of fear. Children in neat uniforms crossed the bridge, their schoolbooks tied with string. They didn't know that the path beneath their feet had once been lined with beggars and grief. Edwin paused beside the river wall, hands trembling slightly from age, and smiled at the sight of Wilson House number 7 across the water. Tall, clean, filled with windows that glowed like lanterns in daylight. He remembered the first one. Small, leaky, smelling of chalk and soup. Now there were dozens across the city, each bearing the same motto carved above the door: "Kindness outlives everything." A little girl, no more than 10, approached and offered him a flower. "Sir," she said, "are you one of the founders?" He chuckled softly. "One of the caretakers, perhaps." "Then you built this?" she asked, eyes bright. He looked at the school, the children running through the courtyard. "No," he said gently. "We only remembered what someone else began." She frowned, thinking, then smiled. "My teacher says Captain Wilson was a hero." Edwin nodded. "He was human. That's harder than being a hero." She skipped away, leaving the flower in his hand. A simple daisy, white against his wrinkled skin. He placed it on the stone ledge and watched it sway in the wind. "Tell me, How do you know when history has forgiven itself? Is it when the pain fades, or when someone finally learns from it? In the archives of Parliament now sat a thin, leather-bound volume, Letters from Cold Harbor Prison. Students read it in classrooms, quoting Wilson's lines as though they were scripture. No one remembered the hunger, the fog, the terror of the raids, only the courage that grew out of them. Dr. Manning had passed years before, her portrait hanging in the main hall of the First House of Light. Finch's Carpentry School still stood beside the docks, its sign worn smooth by sea wind. Every bench, every desk, was made by hands once taught by him. And Edwin, older now, slower, spent his final years teaching reading to the children of immigrants arriving from far lands, telling them that London's heart had room for every voice. Sometimes at night he would walk the same streets, where he once carried petitions in the rain. They were bright now, lined with lamps that stayed lit through the dark. But in the glow he still saw their ghosts. Captain Wilson's calm eyes, Dr. Manning's determined hands, Finch's crooked smile. He whispered their names to the fog, not in mourning but in gratitude. "We kept the promise," he would say, and the city remembered. One autumn evening, standing again by the river, he heard music drifting from a nearby school, children's voices singing the old hymn. There is light in the smoke and mercy in the dust. The hands that build can also heal. And though the night remembers pain, the dawn remembers us. He closed his eyes. The words folded the years like paper, bringing back the shelter, the petitions, the fire beside the Thames. All of it still alive, hidden beneath the calm surface of the present. Tell me, if a city could dream, would it dream of its towers or of the hands that built them? Would it remember the kings or the ones who kept the lamps burning through the storm? When Edwin finally passed, they found Wilson's Bible on his bedside table, open to the page where both hands had once written, "A shelter is not a building, it is a promise." And we kept it. His funeral was small, no officials, no speeches. But that night, the lamps along the Thames burned a little brighter, as if the river itself bowed its head. Years later, when people asked how London had learned compassion, historians pointed to no law, no king, no revolution. They pointed to the letters, to the houses of light, to a season once called the Winter of Ashes. And somewhere beneath the city's endless hum, if you listen closely, you could still hear it, the heartbeat of 1,000 forgotten souls, breathing together through time, not in sorrow, not in glory, but in the quiet certainty that mercy, once awakened, never truly sleeps.